everybody, Mr. Constitution here, Douglas V. Gibbs, and I've been getting a lot of questions over the 14th Amendment and public debt, and I've been talking about it in my classes, but I realized this morning I really wasn't explaining it properly, so I wanted to make a video, make sure that you get the full understanding here. So let's go into public debt, the national debt, the debt ceiling. That's really what it's about. You know, the people in Washington want to raise the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is an illusion, to be honest with you. They're going to raise it. They're going to create more debt, lower it, whatever, regardless of the debt ceiling. Debt ceiling is an internal rule that they've come up with, but it's really just an illusion. And if they don't raise the debt ceiling, we're not going to go into default. That's a bunch of hooey. There will be certain things that don't get funded. The best way, though, to take care of this problem is quit spending money on discretionary spending. A lot of the discretionary spending is not even constitutional, but we'll get into all that in a minute. So first of all, part of the problem is they're claiming that that we have a problem with debt, and the way to fix it is to quote unquote raise the ceiling. In other words, it's like having a toilet broken down in your house. The toilet water is filling the house up with toilet water. It's reaching up above the couch, up to the pictures on the walls, and you decide, you know what, to fix a problem with your house being full of toilet water, because you don't want it to get to the point where the toilet water completely fills the house, you're going to hire a construction crew, have them come out, add some walls around the four sides of your house. That way the ceiling is higher. That way, by percentage, there is less toilet water in your house. Even though there's more toilet water, it's still rising, but by percentage of the total space, it's actually a smaller percentage, and therefore you feel better because now you've fixed your toilet water problem. Why not just fix the toilet? Or better yet, why not open the door and let it all drain out? But that's beside the point. So let's talk about what is the public debt, what is the national debt, and most of the national debt that we have, a large portion of it, if not most of it, comes from the Federal Reserve. There's other, it gets really complex where, your debt is bought by this country and by this investor and so on and so forth. And so I'm not going to get into all that. I want to keep it as basic as we can. So we have a national debt that's almost unserviceable. I'm expecting in my lifetime that there is going to be a calamity, but we'll get to that some other time. And this year, right now, there's a battle over whether or not to raise the debt ceiling. Whether or not it's been solved by the time you see this video is not the point. I want to talk about this in general, this idea that Joe Biden administration, the Speaker Pelosi in the past, I think it was like 5 or 10 years ago, she brought this up, that the Republicans cannot stand in the way of raising the debt limit because of the 14th Amendment. What are they talking about? The 14th Amendment is one of the Reconstruction period amendments. After the war between the states, the Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment's aim was to abolish slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment's aim was to make the corrections that needed to be made regarding civil rights, the apportionment of representatives to the House of Representatives, what type of punishments should be given to politicians that had given an oath to the Constitution but then participated in insurrection or rebellion against the same, and what to do with the debt, and so on and so forth. And then the 15th Amendment took care of voting. Basically says that, regardless of what your history was in servitude, your color, your race, anything, when it comes to those things, you cannot be denied the ability to vote. So 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, Reconstruction amendments, the amendments that are associated with the war between the states. Now, the 14th Amendment has 5 sections. The first section is the Citizenship Clause. What it does is it establishes the whether or not the slaves and their children are citizens, if you're born in the United States, or naturalized, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And that's a discussion for another time. Also in that clause is the Equal Protection Clause, the Due Process Clause. The idea is Privileges and Immunities Clause. The idea is to make sure that these people who have been recently emancipated receive the full benefits of their citizenship, the full benefits, privileges, and immunities of what it is to be an American. Then in the section 2, they make the adjustments, basically change the 3/5 clause to where now these folks who have been emancipated, they are now citizens, so their numbers, their population is now in full representation when it comes to figuring out the apportionment for the states paying taxes to the federal government. That's a different video for another time. And for the number of representatives that a state will have in the House of Representatives. Then the third section gets into what happens if these people who have stood against the Constitution, what happens? They can't run for, they can't hold office anymore, basically, is what it says. And then the fourth, section 4, has to do with the validity of the public debt of the United States. Now, when it says public debt, it means two things. It doesn't just mean money owed by the United States, but also includes money owed to the United States. So it's saying that United States government, federal government, any debt owed to the United States government or the United States government owes is not to be questioned. That's what section 4 says. And then section 5 just indicates that when it comes to all the provisions in the 14th Amendment, it begins with Congress making law. Congress has the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So the actual text of the 14th Amendment, sections 4 and 5, read as follows. The validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned, but neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. Section 5, Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So now let's break down the language. So the validity of the public debt. In other words, is that debt valid? Is it to be repaid? Authorized by law. That means it's gone through the legal process. And I'm going to get more into that in a minute. That authorized by law is a key part of this. Is that debt in existence because it went through the legal process, which means, the legislative process, which means that one of the houses proposed to the, and in this case it's because it has to do with money, it would have to be the House, proposed the piece of legislation, the bill. The U.S. Senate then agreed on it, and then after both houses of Congress agreed upon it, it went to the president for signature, and he signed it, or he vetoed it, but Congress overrode that veto. In either case, it becomes authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion. So it's saying that the debts that the federal government has, the United States has, as a result of insurrection or rebellion, is a part of this. But it also has the word including. So what that means is there are other debts included. They wanted to make sure that existing debts also were included in this. But by wording it the way they did, they also mean any future debts, or at least that's the way it can be interpreted. So including debts. So there's other debts, other federal debts, and the debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion shall not be questioned. In other words, it's debt. There's no question about it. It's going to be paid back. But neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. What that did is that invalidated all debt incurred by the Confederate States. So U.S. federal debt, the United States debt, or debt owed to the United States, shall not be questioned. So any money owed to the United States, or any money that the United States owes, authorized by law, incurred during this war, that already existed or will exist, shall not be questioned. But Confederate debt is invalidated. It is illegal. What this did is this not only punished the Confederacy, this punished those who gave the Confederacy money or goods, expecting the Confederacy to pay them for it. So funding the Confederacy or lending to the Confederacy or giving aid to the Confederacy and expecting payment from the Confederacy, all of that was made null and void. What this did is this punished the European countries that aided the Confederate States during the war between the states. Britain in particular also was sued later on and wound up paying $15,500,000 also for the damage they caused by aiding the Confederacy. Among those items of aid was the blockade runners that were being used to break the federal blockade around the coasts of the Confederate States, and also by building ships in Britain for the Confederacy. Confederacy then was given those ships. They were paying for them until they didn't have the money, and then they were expected to pay Britain for those ships. So the money that they were expecting from those ships, the lent money, basically, that Britain saying, hey, we are owed money for those ships. They never got it because if it hadn't been paid already, because it was made illegal and void, invalidated, and on top of that, they wound up being sued and losing. There was a it was like a 5-country panel that went through it and made those decisions, and then $15,500,000 was what the British had to pay, basically, in a sense, it's sort of like war reparations, but for the damage they caused by supporting the Confederacy. All right, so now that we've got all that out of the way, let's go a little deeper here. When it came to public debt, the Founding Fathers were not fond of it. James Madison said, I go on the principle that a public debt is a public curse, and in a Republican government more than in any other. They believe that a country should pay its way along the way, that there should be no national debt, public debt. Now, there was one person that believed that public debt was a good thing. I'll get to that in the next quote. Thomas Jefferson said, at the time we were funding our national debt, we heard much talk about a public debt being a public blessing. He's referring to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton believed that public debt was a blessing and that we should always be in perpetual debt to raise our credit rating for the purpose of also holding the union together, because if states feel like they owe the national debt, they will be less likely to secede. So at the time we were funding our national debt, we heard much about a public debt being a public blessing, that the stock representing it was a creation of active capital for the element of commerce, manufacturers, and agriculture. This paradox was well adapted to the minds of believers in dreams. He's calling it a big dream that it would be beneficial. Debt was a problem. Jefferson was also quoted as saying that not only should the future generations have to pay the debt of the past generations, but that that debt and banking debt was more dangerous than that of a standing army. So Jefferson had a real problem with debt. He during his presidency, except for 1 year because of the Barbary Wars, the debt went down each year of his 8 years in presidency, except for 1 year. 1 year, it slightly went up once again because they borrowed to fund the Barbary War that he wound up engaged in. You've heard the Marine Corps hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The shores of Tripoli. Tripoli was where today Lebanon is, and we actually invaded the Barbary states because the Muslim pirates were attacking merchant vessels, American vessels, and American military vessels, and taking American sailors as slaves. And they were expecting us to pay tribute in order to use the waters, and which is basically protection money. And Jefferson was against it all along. Washington paid it. Adams paid it. Jefferson finally said, I'm not paying it. Barbary Wars, Jefferson fought the first one, Madison fought the second one, and once again during Thomas Jefferson's presidency, the national debt went down every year of his presidency except for 1 year when the Barbary War was going on, and overall he left with a smaller national debt than what he came in with. Which brings us to this fellow here that you see on the screen now. This is John Marshall. John Marshall was the 4th Chief Justice of the United States. He held the office from 1801 to 1836, and he was a Hamiltonian-minded guy. In other words, he agreed with Alexander Hamilton in his ideas of big government, lots of debt, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason why I bring him up is because he's done something interesting. We're going to use a quote that he had against this idea that the 14th Amendment allows for the raising of the debt limit. If you want to play the game that the 14th Amendment, that Section 4 of the 14th Amendment allows for them to raise the debt limit, there's no constitutional reason not to, that they have to, and this is what has been argued, that that the public debt shall not be questioned. Well, the thing is, John Marshall presents in a judicial opinion something that's very interesting and is actually accurate. Now, he wound up using it for judicial review, which is unconstitutional. That's a discussion for another time. But his statement in Marbury versus Madison of 1803 creates an opportunity for us to take a look at this a little deeper and actually realize that Biden and the Democrats and even the Republicans that believe that the debt limit should be raised, or that the public debt shall not be questioned, and we have to do whatever we can to have more debt and so on and so forth. This something that John Marshall said helps us invalidate all of that. And like I said, he's accurate in what he said. Actually, Jefferson confirms it, or supports it, should I say, or supported it before Marshall said it in the Kentucky resolutions, for example. And the 10th Amendment, and there's all kinds of other things, enumeration doctrine, but we'll get to that. So, what did John Marshall say? What is it that he put out there that is so important here? So, Marbury versus Madison, 5 U.S. 137, 1803. At the very tail end of one of the summaries, one of the parts of his judicial opinion, John Marshall wrote this, and I highlighted, you can see on the screen, the important part here. It is also not entirely unworthy of observation that in declaring what shall be the supreme law of the land. Now let's stop there. He's referring to Article 6 of the United States Constitution, where it says that the United States Constitution of the United States, and the laws made in pursuance of the Constitution, which is key here. If a law is not made in pursuance to the Constitution, it doesn't fit this. The U.S. Constitution, laws made in federal law made in pursuance of the Constitution, and treaties that have been made or shall be made are the supreme law of the land. So, if a law has been made pursuant to the Constitution, it is the supreme law of the land. What if it's not made in pursuance of the Constitution? This is what he's getting at. So it is also not entirely unworthy of observation that in declaring what shall be the supreme law of the land, the Constitution itself is first mentioned, and not the laws of the United States General. In other words, the Constitution is more important than the laws in Article 6. It's mentioned first. But those only which shall be made in pursuance of the Constitution have that rank. In other words, only laws, once again, as I said a moment ago, made in pursuance of the Constitution are the supreme law of the land, like the Constitution. Thus, the particular phraseology of the Constitution of the United States confirms and strengthens the principle supposed to be essential to all written constitutions, that a law repugnant to the Constitution is void, and that courts as well as other departments are bound by that instrument. The rule must be discharged. What he's saying is, if a law put out by the Congress and is or signed, if it becomes law, a law that has been gone through the legislative process, becomes law, but it's repugnant to the Constitution, it's not authorized, it's an unconstitutional law. It's unconstitutional, then it is not law. So, now that brings us back to the 14th Amendment earlier. The validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law. So, if the debt is not constitutional, then the law is void. John Marshall says so. If the law is null and void because it's not constitutional, it is repugnant to the Constitution, then it's not authorized by law because it's null and void. So only the public debt authorized by law, if you want to use the lefties' definitions here, shall not be questioned. If the debt is not authorized by law, in other words, it was unconstitutional, it's based on unconstitutional foundations, then then it can be questioned because it's not authorized. It's unconstitutional. It's not law. It's not authorized by law. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a second because I want to focus on one more thing. And matter of fact, last Saturday, I believe it was, Biden said he wasn't going to be able to use the 14th Amendment to go around Congress to make sure that the debt ceiling was raised. And Yellen, Fed Chair Yellen, the next day said pretty much the same thing. The president couldn't. And what I think they were focusing on was Section 5. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. The provisions are only to be enforced once through a legislative process. The president cannot go around the House because he's mad at them and then force the debt ceiling up on his own with some executive order, because it's not his authority to enforce the provisions of the article. It's up to Congress to enforce the provisions of the article. So that's also an important key here. Now, let's get back to our discussion earlier. So the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law. How much of that debt has been authorized by law? Well, Doug, it has to go through the legislative process. Money cannot be pulled from the Treasury without going through the legislative process. And then it's earmarked. Okay. So here's the question. How much of that money earmarked for things was earmarked for something that's unconstitutional? In 2007, a friend of mine, Tim Kurlan, he went by Loki online, and I went through the entire federal spending budget debt, all of that. We went through with all the federal spending. And by the time we separated what's constitutional in one pile and what's unconstitutional in the other pile, and by the time we were done, 85% of federal spending was being spent on things that are not authorized by the Constitution. So 85% of federal spending is unconstitutional. Therefore, 85% of federal spending is not authorized by law. Because according to John Marshall, if it's unconstitutional, it's null and void. It's not law. If it's not law, it's not authorized by law. So first of all, 85% of federal spending, which pretty much has been borrowed, is debt. It's unconstitutional. But let's take this a step further. Where does the majority of our debt come from? The Federal Reserve. We borrow money from the Federal Reserve to put it into circulation. So also that debt, a major part of the debt, primary part of the debt, is because of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the central bank in which we use in our monetary system. And then after that debt is created, then it's sold to China and sold to this group and that group and investors. And it's, once again, complex game that I mentioned at the beginning that I'm not going to get into. But it begins with the Federal Reserve. So now when it comes to the Federal Reserve, we have something to look at. So the Federal Reserve Act went into effect, or well, it shouldn't go into effect. It was passed in 1913, went into effect in 1914. The United States Federal Reserve System is a central bank. We had two prior to that, the Bank of the United States and the Second Bank of the United States. First Bank of the United States, the charter expired in 1811 when Vice President George Clinton, the Vice President under James Madison, cast the deciding vote to split the tie to disallow it from being the charter from being renewed. So one guy stopped the first Bank of the United States. The second one, it was Andrew Jackson. He ran on getting rid of the central bank. He believed it was a problem. It was not good, and it violated the Constitution. And so in 1836, the second Bank of the United States went bye-bye. Then we didn't have a central banking system until 1914. December 23rd, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law, and then in 1914 went into effect. Now, it was signed into law. Now we go back to John Marshall. Is that law valid? Is it constitutional? Well, now for that, we have to go to Article 1, Section 1 of the United States Constitution. Article 1, Section 1 of the United States Constitution reads, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. All legislative powers, the power to create law, modify law, and repeal law, belongs only to Congress. Vested is the key word here. To grant those powers, all legislative powers herein granted, means there's a grantor and a grantee. The states were granting the power to the Congress, and then it says shall be vested in a Congress. Vested also means to grant, to legally transfer, but it also has a couple of additional meanings to it. It also means that Congress alone has those powers, separation of powers. That's where our separation of powers, which is, the words are not in the Constitution, that's where it manifests, is through the word vested. Article 1, Section 1, Article 2, Section 1, and Article 3, Section 1, which establish the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, all use the word vested, saying that these powers are only given to that part of government. So the legislative powers are only given to Congress. The executive powers are only given to the executive branch or the president. And the judicial powers are only given to the federal court system, the Supreme Court and the inferior courts in which the Congress may create. But vested also has another thing that goes with it, that went with it at the time. If you read Madison's notes, if you read the ratification conventions that went on, I'm not going to go in and give you all the citations here because there's only so much time. This is already a long video. The word vested also means irrevocable. In other words, this power is given to Congress. It cannot be given to anybody else. Any of the powers granted by the Constitution, from the states, through the Constitution, by the Constitution, to the Congress of the United States, are vested in the Congress. In other words, it's their power alone, and they can't give it away. All right, so let's go to another part of the Constitution. Okay, so Article 1, Section 8 is a long section in the United States Constitution. It is the powers of Congress. It is a list of the enumerated authorities. This is what they are authorized to do. Now remember, Article 1, Section 1 says that all legislative powers herein granted, here they are granted in this section, shall be vested in a Congress. So you'll notice now, here in the middle of your screen, it says to coin money. The Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin. It is clear that one of the powers of Congress is to coin money, to create our money, to put it into circulation, and to regulate its value. Who does that today? The Federal Reserve. What did Congress do? Remember in 1914, what went into effect? The Federal Reserve Act. So in other words, Congress gave away their ability to coin money and regulate the value thereof to the Federal Reserve through the Federal Reserve Act. But Article 1, Section 1 says they can't do that. The power is vested in them. Only they have that legislative power, and it is irrevocable because of the word vested. They're not allowed to give it away. The Constitution wasn't even amended to even allow for that anyway. Not that the states, because they knew the states would never approve of such a thing. They took it upon themselves to use a piece of legislation, the Federal Reserve Act, to create the Federal Reserve that is creating all this debt. And the debt created by the Federal Reserve is being created by an entity that is not authorized by law because the Constitution says that the Congress cannot give away that legislative power. If they can't give away that legislative power, then according to John Marshall, in his 1803 Marbury versus Madison judicial opinion, is that if something is repugnant to the Constitution, it is null and void. It is not authorized by law. It's not legal. It doesn't exist. So, if you want to use the 14th Amendment and say, well, the public debt authorized by law shall not be questioned, it's not authorized by law. 85% of the federal spending is unconstitutional, and most of that spending all the spending comes from the Federal Reserve System, is based on an entity that was created unconstitutionally because there's no authority for it. Jefferson argued against any authority that the first bank of the United States and the second bank of the United States could be created because it was unconstitutional. But then Hamilton argued, well, there's implied powers. It implies. How does it imply it? Congress has the authority to coin money, and that power is vested. Shall not be given away. It cannot be given to another entity. It's irrevocable. Therefore, all the debt coming from the Federal Reserve is not authorized by law because it's null and void, because John Marshall was right when he said that if a law is repugnant to the Constitution, it is null and void. It is not law. Hopefully you learned something along the way on this nice, long, interesting video. Hopefully it was interesting to you. So, now you know what to say, right? When someone says, well, can they use the 14th Amendment to raise the debt ceiling? No, they can't. The debt is not authorized by law. And only Congress, even if it was authorized by law, can enforce the provisions of the 14th Amendment. President can't do it unilaterally anyway. So the president cannot enforce, cannot act without Congress on this, and then pretty much almost all the debt is invalid in the sense of whether or not it's authorized by law anyway, and so it can be questioned. Hopefully that answers everything for you. Now go out there and be constitutional mechanics. Go out there and tell the world what you've learned. Hopefully this added a little more to your armament, your political and constitutional armory. Hopefully. Thanks for watching. My name is Douglas V. Gibbs. I am Mr. Constitution. United we stand. Combined we kick butt. God bless America, my friends. God bless you. We'll see you next time. Thanks for spending the time with me. Bye-bye now. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, you learned something from it, you want them to keep coming, you want to help fund what I do, because I've been under attack. I've had, just in the last couple days, 49 articles on Political Pistachio unpublished. We are working on a new website so that I am censorship free, so this type of thing doesn't happen to me. We need help funding those things. I also have a couple of trips to Washington, D.C. I'm supposed to make one of them on Independence Day to be a reader of the Declaration of Independence at the Jefferson Memorial. Another one dealing with one of our good friends who has been, well, let's just say hassled because of the 6th day of the first month of 2021. And I'm supposed to be out there for that. I've got other things I'm supposed to be doing here to when it comes to funding what I do, radio shows, podcasting, improving the quality of these videos by getting new equipment and a space other than my little 9x9 office at home. There's all kinds of things going on, and we need your help. So you can go to politicalpistachio.com or douglasvgibbs.com and hit the donate button. You can go to paypal.com/paypalme/douglasvgibbs. I will continue to keep that, but in the near future I do have a new one coming, hopefully within the next few weeks with a new website as we're working on that. Or you can Venmo me, use Douglas Gibbs 3, that's Douglas-Gibbs-3, and then when it prompts you for the last 4 of my phone number, 3975, or you can just use that QR code there at the bottom of the graphic for Venmo. Or you can Zelle me. Zelle is probably the best way because it goes directly and there's no fee. douglasvgibbs@yahoo.com, douglasvgibbs@yahoo.com, and you can use Zelle. Appreciate any assistance. Like I said, we've got to come up with about $3,000 for the first Washington, D.C. trip. We've got to come up with funding for vehicles, for equipment, $4,000 every quarter for one of the radio shows, $150 a week for the one on KPRZ.com. That one, Mr. Constitution Hour, is on all of the podcast platforms, Amazon Prime, Listen Notes, Odyssey, Spotify, iHeartRadio, you name it, they're out there. There's like 8 of them that we specifically put on. There's like 4 others that have picked up the show. So if you go to Mr. Constitution Hour by Douglas V. Gibbs online, you'll find it on one of those podcast platforms, maybe one that you enjoy, one you use a lot, even Audible. So But that takes funding to get those on the podcast platform. It costs money to do the website. It costs money to my truck blew its engine like 6 weeks ago. I've got one of my students in one of my classes owned a shop for 30 years, so he's gonna we're gonna do the work without the cost of labor, but still, the engine and and all the other stuff goes along with it. So we're probably looking at $4,000. So there's constant funding needs, and so if you want to help out, and if you want to keep this effort going, and you want to see me grow and become a nationwide voice, PayPal.com/PayPalMe/DouglasVGibbs or Venmo Douglas-Gibbs-3 then 3975, or use a QR code, or Zelle douglasvgibbs@yahoo.com. Appreciate it, because we've got, and also buy books. I've got 9 books I've written. I've got number 10 and 11. Hopefully by the end of the summer it'll be out there. One of them is a history book, and I want to get this into private schools and homeschools. The public schools will have nothing to do with it. It is the proper history of our country. It goes through everything you need to know that isn't full of the woke or narrative grabbing stuff. So once again, takes funding. Let's get it funded. Thanks for watching this video. Hopefully you learned something, and we'll see you next time.